Hi everyone, hope you're all doing okay and keeping well. I'm here in the studio just recording a few online lessons for some of my students, and I'm putting together this one which is all about how to play a simple groove. It's usually the first thing that I cover when people start learning the drums. So well, let's get straight into it. So the first thing you need to be able to do is to count to 4. That's a good starting point. And we're going to try and play 4 notes. If you're right-handed, use the right hand, and we're going to play 4 notes on the hi-hat over here. So it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's important when you're playing, I always try and get people to do this, but try and actually count out loud as you're playing these beats. It will help you to know where you are in the sequence when you get to more complicated patterns. So always counting out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. So then the second stage, we're going to add the bass drum, big one on the ground, and that we are going to play on beats 1 and 3. So we're going to keep the same pulse going on the hi-hat, 4 notes there, add the bass drum 1 and 3, so it'll sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, try and keep the counting going out loud if you can. The third stage, we're going to forget the bass drum for the moment, just take that out of the equation. We're going to try and add the snare drum in, and the snare drum is going to go on beats 2 and 4, so opposite where the bass drum was playing. So it would sound like this. 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And so the next job, you can probably guess where this is going. We're going to try and put the whole groove together. So all the parts we've just learnt. So bass drum on beats 1 and 3, snare drum on 2 and 4 with the hi-hat. So it should sound something like this. 1, 2. So it's probably worth spending a little bit of time going over that groove, just making sure that you can play it fluently. And there is nothing wrong as well, it's worth saying this, that if you need to start very, very slowly just to get the coordination, that is a great thing to do. So I might want to play first note and then just get the second note, thinking about them one at a time. Once you're comfortable with that one, we're going to move on to the second groove, and this one is probably one of the most important drum beats that you will ever come across. It gets used a lot in many different songs, and the way it works is very similar to the first one. The only real change that we're making is the way that we're playing the hi-hat. So instead of playing 1 note per beat, we're now going to double the number of notes we're playing here. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the way we normally count that, obviously we've just been counting the beat numbers before. Each of these beats now has a half in the middle, which is called an and. So we'll end up with this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Then it's just a matter of going through the same process that we did with the first groove. So we're taking the bass drum again, bass drum and hi-hat only. The bass drum we're going to aim to play on the first beat and the third beat. So it will sound something like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So then we have the next stage. Again, forget the bass drum for the moment, we've worked on that. We're going to add the snare drum in, again on beats 2 and 4 where it was in the previous groove. So that will sound a little bit like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and then the icing on the cake, the final groove where we put everything together. Bass drum on beat 1 and 3, snare drum on beats 2 and 4, continuous hi-hat. Should go something like this. And when we're trying to play that, there's a few things that's worth thinking about. So, number one, are the notes happening at the same time when we're playing something together on the same beat? So, for example, if we're playing the snare on beat 2, are we playing the hi-hat exactly the same time as the snare, or are we playing them slightly apart? If we play notes slightly apart, it's going to sound very messy. So we need to make sure we're playing them exactly the same time. And so on. So the other thing that's worth thinking about when you're practicing these grooves is the sound that you're making as well. It's one thing to have the coordination done, but you've also got to be conscious of, are the drums sounding good? Are we getting a good sound from the kit? So one thing to think about in particular, I see a lot of beginners when they're playing the snare and they're focused on reading the music, and their left hand gradually wanders over to the edge of the drum, sometimes even off of the drum, but not very often. We've got to make sure that we're playing in the centre of the drum to get a nice big sound from the drum. So over here, it's going to give us a much weaker sound than if we're playing in the centre. For example, on the edge of the drum, move to the middle, gives us a much better sound from the centre. The other thing to consider as well is how we're playing the hi-hat. And again, there are lots of options here, because sometimes we actually want to play the hi-hat with the slightly open, slightly more rocky feel. Sometimes we might want it closed, much tighter. There's no right or wrong with that particular, those two sounds. The ultimate goal is, are we playing the right hi-hat sound to go with the style of music that we're playing? So there's just something to think about there. So the second part of the lesson is trying out a few different variations of ways we can change this groove and maybe change the way that we're playing the bass and snare to create some more interesting patterns. So there is a worksheet that goes with this lesson, and I'm going to go on to the next one, which on the worksheet is 3A, I think. And this groove has an extra bass drum involved. So if we're counting through the sequence, we've got bass drum on 1 and 3, but I'm also going to include a bass drum on 3 and as well. So if I do the bass drum only, it will sound like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 4 and. With the hi-hat snare, it sounds like this. Then we can move on to 3B, which is actually the same groove, exactly the same on the bass and snare. The only difference being that the hi-hat is now, going back to our original groove, is only playing the 4 beats. It's not playing all the ands as well, the quavers. So we are now going to play this. And you'd think that should be easier than playing quavers because there's less notes. But actually that is a bit more challenging, because you'll find in there there's one note you play on the bass drum, or 3 and, where you're not playing a hi-hat. And the body's natural reaction, it wants the right hand and right foot want to always go together. So you're going to have to fight against that a little bit to start with. I see a lot of people play this. Sounds okay, but what we're after here is and so on. So then we're going to have a look at the next groove, which is 4A on the worksheet. Very similar thing, except this time we're going to be playing a double snare instead of a double bass drum, and the snare, the extra note that we're playing, is going to be on 2 and, the second half of beat 2. So again, if I play the snare drum part by itself, 1, 2, 3, and 1, and and then I'll play that with the rest of the groove. So I'm not going to go through all the grooves on the worksheet. I'm just going to pick out a couple which I think are worth looking at. The one I'm going to do next is 5A on the sheet, which is actually very similar to the one we've just done. But the second snare drum that we played on 2-and is replaced with a bass drum. So the bass drum pattern would go like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. With the rest of the groove. And then the other one I'll quickly demonstrate because it's slightly different is 7A, right at the bottom of the worksheet. And the reason this one's different, it actually has the bass and the snare playing together. And this is, again, a very common groove. You hear this one quite a lot. So if I play the bass and the snare parts, the bass drum is playing on all 4 beats. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and the snare drum is playing on beats 2 and 4. So on beats 2 and 4, you'll get bass and snare happening together. So it should sound like this. So the next step with these grooves is when you feel like you've got them under control, you've got the coordination sorted, you can play them relatively smoothly. A good thing to do is work on the timing. So by that, I mean being able to keep the exact same tempo as you're playing without speeding up or slowing down. A lot of drummers are guilty of changing tempo mid-song. It's very hard to actually keep consistent all the way through. A good way to practice that though is working with a metronome. And so I've set a metronome here, it's coming through my headphones, and I'm going to make sure you can hear it in the video as well. I've set it to 80 beats per minute, it's good speed to start at. And I'm going to start with groove 3A, which is the one with the bass drum on beat 3 and 3 and. And again, I'll put the transcription up on the screen. And I'm going to play this with the metronome. And that's a great way of just making sure that your body clock is good, training your body to keep the same tempo the whole time. And you can practice this at lots of different tempos. I think 80 is a good one to start with. It's a nice steady tempo. But also if you struggle to keep that going at that speed, feel free to slow it right down and slow it to maybe 50 or 60. You may actually find though that some of the really slow tempos are actually harder to keep in time than the sort of 70 beats per minute upwards mark, just because there's so much time in between for the notes to get out of sync. So when you're feeling confident with 80 beats per minute, you could turn the metronome up slightly. I'm going to change mine now to 120 and play a little bit of the same groove at that speed. 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and. So I'm aware I've gone quite quickly there from starting at the very beginning through to playing a groove reasonably quickly with a metronome. Now that's going to be quite difficult to achieve in one lesson. What I'm giving you there is an overview of a longer journey that you will be going on. So, good luck.